Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be diving into the often misunderstood world of Iran's military capabilities. You sent us some fascinating sources, changing trends in Gulf military and security forces and the military balance, and we're here to unpack them with you. It seems like Iran's military might be more than just smoke and mirrors.
That's exactly right. Iran has had to be incredibly resourceful in building their military, and that's led to some fascinating strategies.
It really seems like they've had to think outside the box. So first things first, just how big is Iran's military?
It's surprisingly large. We're talking about the largest active military personnel in the entire Middle East and North Africa region, 610,000 strong. To put that into a global perspective, that makes them the eighth largest military force in the world.
Wow, eighth. That's significant. And how does that stack up against a country like Israel, which is often considered a major military power?
Israel's military is indeed formidable, but they only have about 169,500 active personnel. So you can see right away that Iran has prioritized manpower as a key part of its military strategy.
That's a huge difference. But of course, it's not just about the numbers, right? I'm really curious about how Iran structures its military force.
This is where it gets particularly interesting. They've adopted this two-pronged approach that blends conventional warfare with asymmetric tactics. It's all about keeping their adversaries guessing. On one hand, you have the Artesh, their conventional forces covering land, air, and sea.
And on the other hand, you have the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, a name that definitely brings to mind a certain image.
It does, doesn't it? And the IRGC certainly lives up to the intrigue. They're a separate branch specializing in unconventional warfare. Think guerrilla tactics, targeted attacks, and a constant element of surprise.
So they're essentially a separate entity from the main military. That seems like it could create a very complex command structure.
You're right, it does add layers of complexity. And over the past 4 decades, they've become a force to be reckoned with. They have their own ground forces, a naval branch, and even an air force.
Hold on, their own Nebulan Navy. I have to admit, the image of a full-fledged IRGC Navy is not one I had pictured before. What does that even look like?
Think smaller, nimbler, and designed to exploit weaknesses. They've become masters of swarm tactics, deploying a multitude of fast attack crafts and even mini-submarines to overwhelm larger naval forces.
Mini-submarines. Now that's an image I wasn't expecting. It seems like Iran has really embraced the unconventional. And you know what else caught my eye in these sources? The sheer emphasis on missiles in Iran's military strategy. What's the strategic thinking behind that?
It's a classic case of maximizing impact while working within certain limitations. Missiles provide a cost-effective way to project power and deter attacks, all without the logistical challenges and expense of deploying large-scale conventional forces.
That makes sense. But a lot of countries utilize missiles. It's not exactly a new technology. So what makes Iran's approach stand out?
It's the sheer scale and diversity of their missile arsenal that's really remarkable. Changing trends suggest that Iran could potentially overwhelm enemy defenses with the sheer volume of missiles they could launch.
And it's not just theoretical. We saw this in action a little bit with those April 2024 drone attacks on Israel.
Exactly. Which brings us to another area where Iran is really punching above its weight: drones. They've been all over the news lately, and for good reason. Iran has been really heavily investing in its drone program.
It seems like every time you turn on the news, there's another story about Iranian drones.
Yeah.
But what I thought was really fascinating from these sources you sent is the sheer variety in their drone arsenal. It's not just one type of drone they're relying on.
Absolutely. They've developed this really diverse range of drones, each with its own specific purpose. At one end of the spectrum, you have the smaller kamikaze drones, like the Mirage 521, designed for these one-way missions to take out a target.
Kamikaze drones, that sounds almost too daring to be real.
Oh, they're very real. And then there are the larger ones, like those in the Arash series, which pack an even bigger punch. But it doesn't stop there. Iran also has reconnaissance drones like the Ababil-S for intelligence gathering, and even combat drones like the Shahed 149 Gaza, which can strike from a distance with bombs.
It sounds like they have a drone for every occasion.
Yeah.
It's a modern-day aerial arsenal.
Mm-hmm.
And what's remarkable is that Iran is producing many of these drones domestically. It speaks to a level of technological self-sufficiency you don't see in many other countries.
Exactly. By producing these drones domestically, they retain control over production supply chains and, perhaps most importantly, cost. It allows them to field these drones in larger numbers, which, as we discussed earlier, is a key part of their strategy.
It's all about maximizing those resources and exploiting that cost-benefit equation of modern warfare. Because, let's face it, a drone, even a sophisticated one, is significantly less expensive than a manned fighter jet.
Precisely. And this focus on cost-effective solutions like their missile and drone programs isn't just about making the most of limited resources. It's a deliberate strategy to target a key vulnerability of their potential adversaries, especially those reliant on expensive high-tech weaponry. It's asymmetric warfare at its finest.
It's about changing the rules of engagement. But our sources also suggest that even with all this innovation and strategic thinking, Iran's military is not without its weaknesses.
That's right. No military force is invincible. One of Iran's most glaring challenges is the age and condition of some of its equipment. While they've made significant strides in developing indigenous weapons systems, other parts of their military are reliant on outdated technology.
So it's a mixed bag, cutting-edge drones and this massive missile arsenal on one hand, but potentially lagging behind in other areas. Where are the biggest gaps, would you say?
Their Air Force faces significant challenges. They're still flying aircraft like the F-4 Phantom, the T-5 Tiger II, and even the F-14 Tomcat. While these aircraft have a certain historical cachet, their designs are from the 1960s and 70s.
It's a stark contrast to the advanced capabilities of their drone program. Those vintage aircraft are impressive in their own right, but they're up against a whole different generation of fighter jets these days.
Exactly. We're talking about a significant technological gap. Israel, for instance, boasts state-of-the-art aircraft like the F-35 and modernized F-15s. It's not a level playing field in the skies.
It makes you wonder how Iran contends with that kind of disparity in aerial technology. Did the sources offer any insights into that?
Changing Trends actually mentions the challenges Iran faces in keeping those older American-made aircraft in the air. Decades of sanctions and strained political realities have made acquiring spare parts incredibly difficult, which throws a wrench into maintenance and upkeep.
It's a reminder that even the most impressive military hardware is only as good as its ability to stay operational. And these political realities don't just impact their air force, do they?
Not at all. While Iran has invested in modernizing its ground forces, they still face an uphill battle against more technologically advanced adversaries. Their tank force exemplifies this challenge.
Right, we touched upon their tanks earlier. They have some intriguing indigenous designs, but how do those compare to their counterparts in a modern battlefield scenario?
Well, they have tanks like the Sam, a modernized version of the American M60, and the Mobarez, a modified British Chieftain. These tanks have some fight left in them, but they're still outmatched by something like Israel's Merkava Mark V, one of the most advanced battle tanks in the world.
It seems like they're playing catch-up in some respects, trying to bridge that technological gap. And then there's the mystery surrounding the car tank.
Ah, yes, the car. It's shrouded in a certain level of intrigue and speculation. Some defense analysts believe it represents a significant leap forward for Iranian tank design, potentially rivaling tanks like the American Abrams or the Challenger. Others, however, suggest it's not much more than a T-72 with a fresh coat of paint and some upgraded systems.
It sounds like its true capabilities are a bit of an enigma. Until we see it in action or get more concrete information, it's hard to say for sure where it stands.
Precisely. And this theme of uncertainty extends beyond major weapons systems. Changing Trends highlights a recurring challenge for Iran's military. Even when they have access to modern equipment, it's often not available in sufficient quantities to equip the entire force.
So it's not just about having the technology, it's about having enough of it to make a real difference on the battlefield. I imagine that creates its own set of logistical headaches. What are some examples of this disparity in equipment availability?
Well, for example, you might see photos of Iranian soldiers sporting modern Kevlar helmets in military parades. But out in the field, the majority are still wearing older steel helmets. It highlights this gap between showcasing modernity and the reality on the ground.
It's all about creating a certain image, but then there's the practicality of equipping a large force.
Exactly. And this pattern extends to their small arms as well. They produce some decent rifles domestically, such as the KH-2002, but you're far more likely to see older models like the G3 or the Type 56 in the hands of most Iranian soldiers. It's a reminder that modernizing a military force is a complex, multifaceted process. It's not as simple as flipping a switch.
It's fascinating how even these smaller details like helmets and rifles can actually reveal so much about a military's overall capabilities and the challenges they face.
Absolutely. These seemingly minor details can paint a much more complete picture than just focusing on those big-ticket items like tanks and fighter jets.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
And it seems like Iran's Navy is no exception to this trend.
Yeah.
You talked about those intriguing mini-submarines and fast attack crafts, but what about the larger vessels in their fleet?
Well, their submarine fleet is actually relatively modern. They have 4 conventional attack submarines, the newest of which was commissioned just last year in 2023. However, their surface fleet is once again a mix of old and new. While they have acquired some newer frigates, a significant portion of their surface vessels are older models. This limitation likely restricts their ability to project power far from their own coastlines.
So it seems like they've prioritized certain areas of naval development over others, perhaps as a way to maximize their impact in the strategically vital Persian Gulf region.
That's a very astute observation. And this brings us to a crucial point when assessing Iran's military capabilities. It's easy to fall into the trap of simplistic narratives, but as we've seen, the reality is far more nuanced.
It's not a simple case of strong or weak. There's a lot more to consider.
Exactly. While they may lag behind technologically in some areas, their asymmetric capabilities, their focus on cost-effective solutions, and their sheer willingness to absorb losses could make them a formidable opponent in any conflict. It's difficult to predict with any certainty how a conflict would unfold, as there are so many variables at play.
It's that unpredictable human element too, isn't it? The training, the morale, the quality of leadership. Those intangible factors are almost impossible to quantify from the outside.
Precisely. And those intangibles can often be the deciding factor in any military confrontation.
So after diving deep into these sources, what are some key takeaways for our listeners? What's the big picture here?
I think the most important thing to remember is to approach this topic with nuance. Iran's military strength is far more complex than it's often portrayed in headlines or simplified analyses. They've adapted to their limitations, embraced unconventional tactics, and developed unique capabilities that should not be underestimated.
It's a good reminder that the world is rarely black and white. Things are almost always far more complicated than they initially appear.
Indeed. And as we've discovered today, sometimes those complexities are the most fascinating and insightful parts of the story.
Well said. It's definitely given us all a lot to consider. And for our listeners, if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to explore these topics further. You might be surprised by what you uncover. Until next time, keep asking questions and stay curious.